A quiet, black fisherman discovers a massive chain buried beneath the waves, and what he pulls from the ocean will change everything. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your city, your country, or your favorite sea. The storm had ripped through Crescent Bay like a wild beast unchained. All night, the ocean roared against the rocky coast, hurling waves high enough to break the dock pylons and scatter boats like toys. By dawn, the air was heavy with the smell of seaweed and splintered wood. The small town along the main shoreline was silent, as if the world itself had paused to catch its breath. Malcolm Reed stepped out of his weather-beaten cottage, his boots sinking slightly into the mud that now covered his porch. He pulled his faded navy jacket tighter around his shoulders, the fabric worn smooth from years of salt and sun. His dark skin glistened faintly with mist, and his eyes, sharp, patient, ocean-colored, swept the horizon out of habit. He had lived by this water all his life. He knew its moods. But that morning felt wrong. The air carried a weight, a hush that seemed to follow the receding tide. Malcolm walked toward the beach, hands deep in his pockets, the wind tugging gently at his hood. The sand was littered with debris, driftwood, fishing nets, shattered crab traps, even the remains of a small rowboat that had been torn in two. The sea had rearranged the coast overnight, leaving behind a different world. He stopped when something caught his eye. A dull, orange glint half buried in the sand, glimmering under a patch of early sunlight. He frowned, stepping closer. It wasn't wood or plastic. It wasn't a buoy or fishing gear. It was metal, heavy, ancient. Kneeling down, Malcolm brushed his hand through the damp gravel until the shape revealed itself. A massive iron chain, thick as his forearm, its surface scarred and crusted with rust. Each link was solid, forged, and far larger than anything he'd ever seen used for mooring or hauling traps. The chain stretched along the sand for several yards, then vanished directly into the gray-green water. "What in the world?" he murmured, his voice almost lost in the wind. He tried pulling one of the links. It didn't move, not even an inch. He gritted his teeth, dug his boots into the wet sand, and heaved again. Nothing. The chain might as well have been a part of the earth itself. A cold shiver traced down his spine. The sea hid many things, wrecks, relics, secrets, but something about this felt deliberate, too perfect, too still. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the point where the chain disappeared into the surf. The waves rolled in softly now, brushing over the first few links like they were guarding a secret. Malcolm reached into his jacket and pulled out his old phone, cracked along the corner but still working. He snapped a few photos, kneeling again to capture the scale. The wind howled faintly behind him, carrying with it the metallic scent of the ocean's breath. He'd seen plenty of wreckage before. Lobster traps lost in storms, half-sunk fishing vessels that washed up after a bad winter. But this wasn't ordinary. The metal wasn't shaped like anything modern. The craftsmanship felt old, maybe even older than the wars that had scarred the Atlantic long before he was born. He straightened, eyes narrowing. Somewhere, deep in the pit of his stomach, a feeling began to rise. Curiosity, yes, but also unease. He had grown up listening to old fishermen tell stories of the sea's memory, how it never truly forgot, how sometimes it returned what it once took. Some called it superstition. Malcolm called it respect. You didn't question the ocean. You listened. Now, standing before the chain, he couldn't shake the sense that it was calling him to do something, to look closer, to uncover what it had held hidden for decades, maybe longer. He turned toward the town, the mist clinging to his jacket as he walked back along the dunes. The sound of the waves followed him, soft but persistent, like a whisper that wouldn't fade. At home, he made coffee, though the taste barely registered. His eyes kept drifting to the window, to the thin line of fog where sea met sky. Every few minutes, he checked the photos again on his phone, zooming in on the details of the rusted metal, the worn grooves that told of pressure and time. Finally, he picked up the receiver of his landline and dialed the number for the local harbor office. "This is Reed," he said when someone answered. His voice was steady, but a quiet urgency lay underneath. "Found something unusual down by the east shore. Looks like a heavy chain. Big, real big. Might be a part of a wreck." The man on the other end promised to send someone to take a look. Malcolm thanked him and hung up. By afternoon, 2 Coast Guard officers arrived in a white pickup, their uniforms crisp despite the damp. One young, clean-cut, the other older, with gray in his beard and a voice that carried command. Malcolm led them down to the side, his boots crunching through gravel. The chain was still there, now half swallowed by the returning tide. The younger officer crouched beside it and ran his gloved hand along the rusted metal. "That's no fishing gear," he muttered. The older one nodded. "You did the right thing calling it in, Mr. Reed. We'll need to get a team down here. Could be dangerous." "Dangerous?" Malcolm asked quietly. The man shrugged. "Old ordnance, structural collapse, who knows? The sea's full of surprises." As they packed their gear, the younger officer snapped a few photos for the report. The older one turned to Malcolm again. "We'll send divers out tomorrow morning. Probably nothing, but better safe than sorry." Malcolm just nodded, his gaze fixed on the ocean. The word dangerous lingered in his mind long after they left. That night, the town began to hum with quiet talk. Crescent Bay was small and word traveled fast. Some said it was an old anchor from a cargo ship. Others whispered about wartime wrecks, lost submarines, even hidden treasure. Malcolm didn't join the gossip. He sat on his porch, staring out at the restless black water. The moon shimmered faintly across the waves, and somewhere beneath that surface, he imagined the chain stretching downward, endless, tethered to something that did not want to be found. The wind shifted, colder now. He could almost hear it. Not the crash of waves, not the gulls, but a low, steady sound like a heartbeat beneath the sea. He closed his eyes. The ocean had always taken boats, men, lives, but sometimes, just sometimes, it gave something back. And as Malcolm sat listening to the distant hiss of the tide, he felt deep in his bones that whatever the sea was giving back this time, it would change everything. By morning, Crescent Bay was no longer just a strip of quiet Maine coastline. It was a staging ground. When Malcolm stepped onto the sand at first light, there were already tire tracks in the wet earth and boot prints crossing in tight patterns. A temporary perimeter had been marked off with bright tape. Equipment crates sat in the dunes like low-metal animals. The air hummed with low voices, radios, the clink of metal, the subtle hiss of oxygen tanks being tested. They had moved fast. The Coast Guard hadn't come alone this time. There were divers in heavy black suits checking straps and seals, technicians running cable, an officer speaking into a radio with the clipped calm of someone who has done this before and knows how quickly it can turn bad. Malcolm stood outside the taped line, hands in his jacket pockets, watching. He was not part of the operation. Nobody had said that out loud, but he felt it. Still, they all knew who he was. "You Reed?" The voice came from a man adjusting his regulator. tall, broad, maybe in his 40s. His wetsuit stretched tight over layered gear, harness clipped with tools, light modules, cutting equipment. Dark skin, steady eyes. He looked tired in the way working men look tired, not weak, but aware. "Yeah," Malcolm said. The diver nodded once, respectful. "Name's Carter. We're going to find out what your chain is hooked to." Malcolm grunted softly. "Wasn't trying to make trouble." Carter gave a ghost of a smile at that. Trouble was always there. You just pointed at it. He turned and walked toward the water. The divers moved with a practiced rhythm. Harnesses on, tanks secured, lights clipped, lines attached. There was no drama to it, no shouting, just quiet, efficient preparation in the cold morning air. The ocean, after the storm's rage, had settled into a slow pulse. Pale gray-green, low rolling swells. The kind of water that looks calm from shore but goes black fast once you're under. "Visibility's gonna be trash," one of the techs muttered into his mic. "We'll be on tether and lamps. Stay clean on the descent." A supervising officer, square jaw, salt at the temples, raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. "We follow the chain, nothing else. We don't kick up silt unless we have to. We don't touch anything we don't have to. We keep chatter tight, and we flag anything that looks like ordnance. Nobody plays hero today. Clear?" "Copy," came 3 voices at once. Carter was first in. Malcolm watched him walk backward into the surf, boots sinking, water rising up his suit. The Atlantic swallowed him inch by inch, then all at once. One moment there was a man. The next there was only water and faint, fading bubbles. A second diver went in, then a third. The surface rolled, then smoothed, like a curtain closing. The waiting began. Time on land moves differently when people you can't see are somewhere below the surface, attached to you only by rope, steel, and trust. Minutes stretch. The smallest sound becomes important. Every scrap of radio noise makes you look up. The base radio crackled with static. "Surface, Diver 1. We're on approach. Depth 15. The officer leaned forward. "Copy. Follow the line. Report condition. Chain intact. Heavy corrosion. Barnacle growth significant. We still have tension." Tension, Malcolm thought. So that thing was still pulling even under there. A pause. The only sounds now were the low wash of waves and the tight, clipped breathing of the crew on shore. "Depth 25. Visibility low. Beam on." Malcolm hadn't realized he'd started holding his breath until his chest ached. He let it out slowly and set his jaw. "Depth 40. Carter's voice came again through a sleeve of static. "Chain widens. Links are thicker. Repeat, links are thicker. That's not standard anchor chain." The supervising officer frowned at that. He didn't say anything, but Malcolm saw his hand tighten around the radio. Another beat. "Depth 50. We have contact." The radio hissed, then carried Carter's voice, lower now, more controlled. "Surface. We've got structure." The officer's voice sharpened instantly. "Describe." A muffled breath, a faint clink of gear. When Carter spoke again, there was something different just under the words. Not panic, not shock, respect. "Looks like hull plating. Metal frame. Large. It's down on its side in the silt. Starboard's split open along the midsection. I'm seeing rib structure. This is a warship. Repeat, this is military. Old." Someone on shore swore under their breath. The younger tech glanced instinctively at Malcolm, then quickly looked away like he hadn't meant to. Malcolm barely noticed. His attention was locked to that radio like it was a lifeline. "Can you identify class?" the officer asked. "Stand by." A pause. Bubbles. The distant, hollow tap of metal against metal. Then Carter's voice came back, lower. "We're looking at a destroyer-type hull. Bow-mounted chain point. Your chain is bolted into reinforced steel at the nose. This wasn't drift. This is fixed." A long silence followed that. Even the gulls circling overhead seemed to quiet. A destroyer. Malcolm didn't know everything about ships, but he knew that word. It didn't belong to pleasure boats or weekend fishermen. It belonged to war. He swallowed. The air felt colder now. Carter kept talking, and this time his breathing had gone tight. "I need to flag this right now. There's debris around the breach. I'm seeing canisters. Cylindrical. Wait." The line crackled hard with interference. "Carter, say again," the officer snapped. "Repeat last. What are you seeing?" Static. Then Carter's voice, clipped and serious in a way it hadn't been a minute before. "Surface. We've got ordnance down here. Repeat. We've got ordnance. Multiple units. Looks like depth charges. I'm also seeing what may be anti-ship shells. Some appear intact. I say again, some appear intact." Every muscle on shore locked. The supervising officer's face changed. Calm moved over him like a mask dropping into place. His voice went steady, controlled. "All divers, listen up. You're coming back. Slow and clean. Nothing gets bumped. Nothing gets touched." "Carter, you're leading them out. Confirm." "Copy," Carter answered. "We're exiting. Slow ascent. We're leaving everything undisturbed." The next minutes crawled. The ocean didn't care. The tide kept breathing in and out, like nothing had shifted beneath the skin of the water. But on shore, no one moved more than they had to. No one joked. No one checked their phones. Malcolm watched the surface with eyes that didn't blink. Then bubbles. Then movement. Then a black helmet broke through the dull green surface. Water streaming off heavy gear like molten glass. Carter. He gasped and pulled the mask up, sucking in main air like it mattered. The other divers surfaced seconds later, following his trail. Crew moved forward fast, hauling them in with practiced hands. No cheers, no relief exhaled, just quiet. Tense, professional. The officer was there in moments. "Report." Carter sat on the edge of the boat, hands on his knees, chest still heaving. Drops of seawater clung to his beard and ran down his jaw. When he looked up, his eyes cut briefly to Malcolm, then back to his commander. "It's not scrap," he said. "It's not local. It's not modern." "What is it then?" the officer asked. Carter's answer was simple. "It's a wreck," he said, "and it's a grave." Nobody spoke after that. The words hung over the shore like fog. The mood flipped immediately from curiosity to caution. A Coast Guard crewman started unspooling more tape, expanding the perimeter back into the dunes. Another man got on the radio to call Portland. Someone else started listing possible charges. "We're going to need EOD. We're going to need secure transport. Get the Navy on the line. I want historical attached too." Malcolm stood still and listened. He felt the shift. He felt it move through the air like a current. This wasn't, let's see what washed up. This was now federal, military, dangerous. Bigger than him, bigger than the town, bigger than anyone standing on that sand. Carter finally peeled off his gloves and walked over to Malcolm. Up close, Malcolm could see salt in the lines of his skin, the faint tremble in his still wet hands. "You pulled on that chain?" Carter asked quietly. "Tried," Malcolm said. Carter gave a tight nod. "Don't touch it again." Malcolm huffed. "Wasn't planning on it." They both stood there for a second, watching the water together. Carter dropped his voice. "Listen," he said. "What's down there? It's old Navy steel, the real thing. That chain of yours?" He lifted his chin toward the tide. "It's locked into her bow. That means it wasn't junk. That means she went down fast and hard with everything still on her. Could have been storm, could have been combat, doesn't matter yet. Malcolm said nothing. He was listening. Carter continued, steady, respectful. We saw blast damage. We saw torn plating. We saw compartments cracked open. We didn't see bodies, but... He let the sentence hang. There's no way she went down empty. So, they're still there, Malcolm said softly. Carter's jaw flexed. Yeah, he said. Yeah, maybe. Malcolm looked out at the Atlantic. The gray water rolled in, rolled out, indifferent and endless. He had always known this ocean could swallow men whole. He had always known it could take a life and erase the evidence in seconds. That was nothing new. But this wasn't erasure. This was concealment. This was something the sea had decided to keep. Hold, guard, until now. The supervising officer approached them, voice lower now. Mr. Reed, he said, more formal than before, I need you to understand that what you found is not just debris. We're treating this as a possible wartime site. That means it's restricted from here on out. We'll have additional personnel coming in. We're going to lock this place down until it's assessed and cleared. Malcolm nodded once. I get it. The officer looked at him for a beat, then added something that felt heavier than protocol. You did the right thing, he said quietly. People said that easily. Usually, it didn't mean much. But here, on this cold strip of Maine shoreline with the surf breathing softly and the air full of salt and tension, it landed differently. Malcolm didn't answer. He didn't nod. He just watched the water and listened to the Atlantic turning over its secrets. That afternoon, word began to crawl through Crescent Bay faster than the tide. You couldn't stop it. You could throw tape around the beach, you could bring in uniforms and hard faces and official voices, but you couldn't stop talk. By sunset, 4 different stories were already alive. Some said Malcolm had found an old treasure ship chained to some lost vault. Others said it was a German U-boat from the war. Others swore the government had been looking for something off this coast for decades, and it had finally surfaced. By the time the lights in Murphy's bar flicked on, the story had already evolved twice. Somebody claimed the chain was attached to a nuclear device. Somebody else said a spy vessel. Most of it was nonsense. Malcolm didn't bother correcting any of it. He didn't go to Murphy's. He didn't go into town. He didn't answer his phone. He didn't post anything. He didn't even turn on the TV. He went home, rinsed salt from his jacket, and sat on his porch as the light faded to ash over the Atlantic. He could still see the spot where the chain disappeared into the water. He could still hear Carter's voice. It's a wreck, and it's a grave. Malcolm leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, his dark face lit by the low smear of evening. He had pulled lobster traps out of seas that didn't want to give them back. He had hauled busted engines off the bottom with nothing but cable, grit, and prayer. He had cut lines free in weather that killed men younger and stronger than him, and yet he had never, not once, felt what he felt now. Not fear, not danger, calling. Like something down there, in the cold dark under the waves, had been waiting for somebody to notice. Waiting for somebody who wouldn't sell it, brag about it, bury it, somebody who would listen. The chain hadn't washed up for no reason. The storm hadn't ripped the beach open for no reason. The sea does not waste effort. He knew that in his bones. Night settled over Crescent Bay, and the only sound left was the steady push and pull of the tide. The ocean had roared and raged and torn this place apart. Now it had gone quiet, not peaceful. quiet like a held breath. Malcolm stayed out there in the dark long after the generators on the beach shut down and the Coast Guard trucks pulled away. He watched the black line of the horizon and felt, without being able to explain why, that this was not the end of anything. This was the beginning. By dawn, Crescent Bay no longer felt like home. It felt like history had decided to rise from the water and claim its place among the living. The beach was now fenced with warning signs and guarded by men in uniform. The smell of salt mixed with oil, metal, and wet sand. The hum of generators replaced the cries of gulls. Malcolm Reed stood at the edge of the dunes, hands in his pockets, staring toward the water where the chain had once glinted in the sunlight. Now it was gone beneath the tide, swallowed back into gray depths. The waves rolled in quietly, indifferent to what they had revealed. A white tent stood near the perimeter marked with the emblem of the U.S. Navy. Inside, specialists examined rusted fragments under bright lamps. Malcolm watched them move like surgeons around a wounded body, careful and reverent. Heavy machinery rumbled in the background, pulling twisted steel from the shallows. Every piece was tagged and catalogued as if the past itself were on trial. He didn't belong there, not really. He wasn't military, wasn't press, wasn't part of any official crew. But no one had asked him to leave. Maybe they understood that what had been found started with him, a fisherman, a quiet man who had simply listened when the sea whispered. The sound of boots on sand pulled his attention. A woman in a dark windbreaker approached. Her hair was tied back, her cheeks red from windburn, her expression tired but focused. She carried a tablet under one arm and offered a polite nod. "You must be Mr. Reed," she said, "the man who found the chain." Malcolm nodded. "That's me." "I'm Dr. Rebecca Hall," she said, extending a hand. "Naval historian with the Recovery Division. We've been reviewing records about the site." Her grip was firm, her voice calm, the kind that belonged to someone used to working with tragedy. "What'd you find?" Malcolm asked. She glanced towards the sea, then back at him. "Confirmation. The ship's identification plate was recovered last night." She paused, as if the next words carried more weight than they should. "It's the USS Anchorage." Malcolm frowned. "Never heard of her." "You wouldn't have," Dr. Hall said softly. "She disappeared in 1944, World War II, an escort destroyer. She left Portsmouth carrying munitions and supplies for a convoy heading across the Atlantic. A storm struck 3 days later. The ship vanished. No distress call, no debris, 86 men aboard." "86," Malcolm repeated quietly. She nodded. "Families were told they were lost at sea. No trace was ever found, until now." The words lingered between them like fog. Malcolm looked out toward the horizon, his mind filled with images he didn't want. Men trapped below deck, the sound of engines dying, the weight of water pressing in. "So," he said finally, "all this time, they were right here?" Dr. Hall exhaled, slow and heavy. "Seems that way. The Atlantic hides what it wants. Sometimes it gives it back when it's ready." Her tone made him glance at her. There was reverence there, and sorrow. "Any sign of—" He hesitated. "Of them?" "Not yet," she said, shaking her head. "The structure's unstable. We're proceeding carefully. The ordnance down there makes it dangerous. But even if we never find remains, the identification alone gives those families something they never had, a place to grieve." Her words should have felt comforting, but they didn't. There was something unbearable about imagining 86 lives reduced to a nameplate and a caution sign. Dr. Hall studied him quietly. "You've lived here long?" "All my life," Malcolm said. Fishin', fixin' boats, same as my father did. She nodded slowly. Then you know what storms can do. Storms take what they want, he said. The sea don't bargain. Dr. Hall's eyes softened. Maybe not, but sometimes it remembers. She excused herself soon after, leaving Malcolm standing alone by the water line. The clouds were beginning to break apart overhead, the light returning in slow gold streaks. The tide was low, and the distant hum of machinery carried across the bay. Malcolm stayed until the crews started to pack for the evening. The sun slid lower, brushing the horizon in pale fire. He turned back toward town, his boots crunching in the sand. At home, the silence hit him harder than usual. The ocean had always been his companion, steady and predictable, even in its anger. But now it felt changed, like something vast and ancient had opened its eyes. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old photograph of his wife, Lena. It had been 10 years since she died, and her smile still carried warmth, even through the faded paper. He remembered the night she passed, the helplessness, the way he'd sat beside her bed as rain beat against the window. That same sound echoed in his memory now, merging with the rhythm of the tide. Maybe, he thought, that was what grief did. It anchored you, held you still when everything else kept moving. Maybe that was what the ocean had done for those men, kept them in one place, waiting until someone was ready to see them again. The next morning, he walked back to the dunes. The sun had returned, but the air was cold and sharp. More vehicles were parked near the site, Navy trucks, heavy equipment, and a new set of warning signs. Beyond them, a cluster of divers prepared to descend again. Malcolm stopped just outside the barrier. A young soldier noticed him and nodded politely. "Morning, sir. You're the fisherman, right?" "The one who found it." Malcolm smiled faintly. "Guess that's me." "Then you might have given a lot of people something they've been waiting their whole lives for," the soldier said. "A little closure." Malcolm didn't answer right away. He watched the water, calm and endless, glinting silver in the light. Closure was a strange word. It sounded clean, too clean for what it meant. There was no closure in death, only acceptance. As the first diver slipped beneath the surface, Malcolm felt the wind shift. Somewhere deep below, those men, fathers, sons, brothers, were still waiting. And now, at last, they weren't alone. The ocean had kept their story locked away for 79 years. Now, through him, it had begun to speak. Night fell over Crescent Bay, but it didn't bring quiet. The beach was lit like a forward operating base. Tall portable floodlights threw pale white across the sand, turning the wet shore into a sheet of dull silver. Generators hummed in a steady low growl. Canvas tents snapped and shivered in the wind. Shadows of men in navy jackets and bomb suits moved in and out of the light. Malcolm Reed watched from just beyond the restricted line, where the sand gave way to dune grass. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, the cold biting through the fabric, his dark face washed ghost pale by the floodlights each time they swung his way. He said nothing. No one spoke to him. But no one asked him to leave either. This was no longer curiosity. This was risk. He could feel it in the air. Earlier that afternoon, the Navy's EOD unit, explosives disposal, had arrived. Heavy cases, hardened faces, no wasted movement. They weren't here for rumor or history. They were here because the wreck under the water wasn't just a relic, it was live. The USS Anchorage hadn't gone down empty. It had gone down armed. Now, 80 years later, that was still a problem. The divers had mapped what they could and marked locations of anything unstable. Charges, depth weapons, munitions canisters. Some of them, Carter had said quietly, were still sealed. Sealed meant pressure. Pressure meant tension. Tension meant danger. If even one of those devices failed the wrong way during removal, the blast wouldn't just take the wreck. It could kill everyone on the shoreline. Malcolm understood that in his bones. The Atlantic doesn't care what year it is. It only cares what you touch. He watched two techs in reinforced suits handling a thick metal case that had just come up from the water. They didn't cradle it like treasure. They carried it like something that wanted to hurt them. Slow steps. Controlled breathing. Full focus. One misstep, and Crescent Bay would be known for a different kind of memorial. Farther down the beach, a team worked under a tent, voices low, heads bent over a table. Dr. Rebecca Hall was among them. She looked different under artificial light. Her face lined with fatigue, her hair pulled back tighter, her shoulders squared in a way that said she'd been awake for too long. But her eyes were clear. Steady. She wasn't just studying a ship. She was keeping vigil. Malcolm stayed where he was. Time blurred. He didn't know how long he'd been standing there when it happened. A burst of light down near the far end of the fenced area. It wasn't violent. It wasn't fire. It was a fast, contained flash, like lightning without thunder. His body reacted before his mind did. His jaw clenched, his shoulders locked. Every instinct in him flared, but the beach did not explode. No shockwave, no scream. Seconds later, a voice came across one of the radios, calm and professional. Controlled detonation. Repeat. Controlled. Package neutralized. Area remains stable. Malcolm let his breath go. So this is what it took, he thought. This is what it took just to make it safe enough to tell the truth about what happened out there in 1944. He stayed until the cold seeped through his boots and into his bones. The Atlantic rolled and whispered in the dark beyond the floodlights, always moving, always breathing. It sounded almost like a heartbeat when he finally went home. The sky over Crescent Bay was a flat slate gray, the moon swallowed behind low cloud. He didn't turn on his TV. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't even make coffee. He just sat at a small kitchen table, elbows on the wood, hands folded, and listened to the distant hum of generators from down the shore. He had the strange, unshakable feeling that he wasn't alone in the room. Not ghosts, presence. The kind of quiet you get in a church when everyone is praying at once and no one is speaking. He slept in a chair, his jacket still on. By morning, the air had shifted. When Malcolm walked back to the beach, he could feel it before he could see why. The tension wasn't gone, but it had changed. What filled the shore now wasn't urgency. It was gravity. Something had happened. He reached the perimeter tape and stopped. The first thing he noticed was the way the crew moved. Slower, more careful. Not because they were unsure, because they were carrying something that mattered. The second thing he noticed was Dr. Hall. She wasn't in the tent anymore. She was standing outside it, near one of the folding tables, holding something close to her chest with both hands, like it was fragile. When she looked up and saw Malcolm, she didn't wave him back. She didn't ask permission. She walked to him. "Mr. Reed," she said softly. Her voice was different, not just tired, full. "What'd you find?" Malcolm asked quietly. Dr. Hall glanced over her shoulder, then back to him. The wind lifted the edge of her jacket and whipped strands of hair across her face. Her eyes shone, but not with excitement, with something closer to grief. "We found this wedged inside a partially sealed compartment," she said. "The hull must have trapped an air pocket when the ship went down. It protected what was inside. It shouldn't have survived at all, but somehow it did." Carefully, she unwrapped what she was holding, a small, corroded metal frame. Inside it, under damaged but still visible glass, was a photograph. It had warped and browned from time, but the image was clear enough. 3 sailors, young, standing shoulder to shoulder on a sunlit deck, arms slung over each other's shoulders like brothers, smiling, alive. For a moment, Malcolm couldn't speak. They weren't names on a plaque in that picture. They weren't numbers in a report. They were people. Real, present, laughing, joking, breathing, existing in a world that had sunlight and salt wind and noise. The world had gone on without them. But inside that cracked frame, they hadn't gone anywhere. "We think this was personal," Dr. Hall said quietly. "They probably kept it near their bunks. Photos like this were common. Crew snapshots, good luck charms, something to write home about. We found it in what looks like a narrow passage near crew quarters. The compartment was partially collapsed, but this was wedged tight." Malcolm stared at their faces. He couldn't look away. "Can you tell who they are?" he asked. "Not yet," she said, "but we will. We're already lining this up against naval records. Every man assigned to the anchorage had a personnel file. A lot of those files have photos. Once we match them, we can call their families." "After all this time," Malcolm said. His voice came out low, rough. "After almost 80 years, somebody's going to get a call." "Yes," she said. The word was simple, but it landed like a bell. Malcolm swallowed. He felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with cold air. He felt the weight of the moment, and it settled into him like an anchor. "Do you understand what you did?" Dr. Hall asked softly. "I didn't do nothing but walk the beach," Malcolm said. Her expression said she didn't agree. "The USS Anchorage wasn't just a ship," she said. "It was 86 men. The last transmission they ever sent came in during a storm. The message cut out mid-sentence. The captain's final words were, 'We'll hold the line.' After that, nothing. Silence. They were written off, declared lost in action. Their families were told there was no body to bury, no place to visit, no answer. Just loss." She paused. Her voice lowered. "Mr. Reed, you just gave those families a place to stand. Wind moved across the dunes, cold and clean. The waves pushed in, slid back. The whole shoreline felt like it was listening." Malcolm looked again at the photograph. 3 men locked in time, laughing like nothing could touch them. He imagined the rest, someone's only son, someone's big brother, somebody who was supposed to come home and never did. He felt his throat tighten. "Can I?" he asked. Dr. Hall nodded and placed the frame carefully in his hands. The metal was cold, the glass chipped at the edges. Salt stains had bled into the image, leaving faint ghost-like streaks, but the faces were still there. Clear, bright, young. "Most of them were," she said quietly. Something in him cracked at that. They were kids. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, holding that little piece of the past, but the world around him faded to dull, distant shapes. All he could see were those faces. All he could hear was the slow, patient pull of the tide. He handed the frame back with both hands. Dr. Hall wrapped it again, careful, almost ceremonial. "We'll preserve it," she said. "It'll be logged, secured, temperature stabilized. We'll make digital copies, but we'll keep the physical one intact. People should be able to look at it. People should see what was lost." Malcolm nodded once. He agreed. That wasn't evidence. That was proof. Proof that they were here. Proof that they mattered. Proof that the USS Anchorage was not a myth, not a footnote, not a rumor. It was a story with faces, and now the world was going to have to look. By midday, the story had already escaped Crescent Bay. Reporters had been circling for a day, held at a distance by Coast Guard tape and very patient but very firm Marines. Now they had a headline. The phrase, "Lost Wowo-Tutu destroyer found off Maine coast," was being repeated in hushed voices up and down the pier. Malcolm ignored them. He left the beach, cut across the dunes, and took the long way home along the back road to avoid the camera vans. He didn't want to be on TV. He didn't want interviews. He didn't want to be the fisherman who discovered the ghost ship. This wasn't about him. He knew that in his bones. This was about 86 men who never got to come home. He heated coffee on the stove and sat by the window, shoulders hunched, hands wrapped around the mug for warmth. From his kitchen, he could see the thin line of the Atlantic between two rooftops. It was calm now, deceptively calm. Soft, gray light drifted across the surface like smoke. He thought of Lena. 10 years gone, and sometimes he still reached for her without thinking. Loss doesn't leave. It just gets quieter. He understood, in that moment, with a kind of painful clarity, what Dr. Hall had meant by a place to stand. If someone had told him, after Lena died, that there was no grave, no marker, no proof she had ever existed except paperwork and memory, he wasn't sure he could have lived with that. You need somewhere to go, somewhere to talk to the air and pretend it talks back. Now, because of a storm and a chain and a decision he almost didn't make, those families might finally have that. Not an explanation, not a miracle, something smaller, something truer. A place. The next day, Dr. Hall returned. She found him where she always could, near the shore. The floodlights were gone now, the generators quiet. Most of the heavy gear had been pulled back behind temporary fencing. The danger hadn't passed, not completely. The wreck was still under, still compromised, still armed, but the immediate threat had been contained. The urgency had settled into watchfulness. Where there had been chaos, there was now reverence. The beach didn't feel like an investigation site anymore. It felt like a vigil. Dr. Hall walked beside Malcolm in the damp sand, her voice low. "When we're done securing the site," she said, "there will be a formal ceremony. The Navy's already drafting it. The Coast Guard will coordinate with the town. A memorial marker will be set up near the dunes, listing the crew of the Anchorage. The families will be invited." Malcolm nodded once. It felt right. "Mr. Reed," she added softly, "they're going to ask you to be there." He didn't answer at first. The water rolled in and touched the toes of his boots before sliding back again. "I ain't much for standing in front of crowds," he said finally. "I know," she said. "You won't want the cameras. You won't want people saying your name. But you should understand something." He glanced at her. Her expression was steady, tired, sincere. "You didn't just find metal," she said. "You gave them back their story." He looked back toward the Atlantic. The sky was pale and cold, washed in thin light. The water breathed in slow, patient rhythm, like the earth itself was calming. For the first time since the chain broke the surface, Malcolm felt something new under his ribs. It wasn't fear. It wasn't shock. It wasn't even grief. It was responsibility. The kind you don't ask for. The kind you don't walk away from. The kind the ocean puts in your hand and says, "Hold this. Don't drop it." He nodded once. "I'll be there," he said. The tide whispered at his feet in reply. The deep had spoken. The past had surfaced. Now came the part that mattered most. Not discovery, remembrance. And Crescent Bay, whether it was ready or not, was about to become the place where history came home. The morning of the memorial rose cold and clear. The tide moved slow and quiet against the shore, like a breath drawn in before a prayer. The sky was pale gold, the kind of fragile light that only comes after too many gray days. Crescent Bay was still, but not empty. People stood along the dunes in dark coats, hats pulled low, hands folded or holding flowers. The hum of engines and tools was gone. Only the sound of the sea remained. Malcolm Reed arrived early, walking the same path he had every morning since the storm. His boots sank into the sand, leaving prints that the wind would soon erase. The memorial site stood just above the tide line, a single stone slab set into the earth, smooth and dark, its surface engraved with 86 names. Someone had tied small flags to the posts, and a faint breeze made them whisper. He stopped a few yards away and looked out toward the horizon. The chain that had started all of this was gone now, taken back by the sea. But he could still see it in his mind, stretching beneath the waves into silence. A few minutes later, Dr. Rebecca Hall approached. She wore her Navy windbreaker, her hair pinned back against the wind. "Mornin', Mr. Reed," she said quietly. "Mornin', Doc," he replied. "You ready?" He glanced at the small gathering forming behind them. Officers in dress uniform, families clutching photographs, townspeople standing in respectful quiet. "As I'll ever be," he said. They moved towards the crowd together. The mayor of Crescent Bay gave a brief introduction, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke about history, sacrifice, and how the sea both takes and gives. Then a Navy officer stepped forward. His speech was short and formal, but when he began to read the names of the lost crewmen, the air itself seemed to change. Each name fell heavy, like a stone dropped into deep water. Malcolm listened, eyes lowered. Some names were familiar, ones Dr. Hall had mentioned in passing, but most were strangers. Young men who had vanished before he was even born, whose lives had ended not in battle, but in the quiet violence of a storm. When the last name was read, a long silence followed. No one spoke. The waves filled the space instead, rolling and receding with slow rhythm. Then an officer turned to Malcolm. "Mr. Reed," he said, "would you do the honors?" For a moment, Malcolm didn't move. He wasn't used to being looked at, to being the center of anything. But Dr. Hall gave him a small nod, and he stepped forward. A small wooden skiff waited at the edge of the water. Inside were 3 wreaths of white lilies, their petals trembling in the breeze. Malcolm picked one up carefully. The flowers were cool against his calloused hands. He carried it into the shallows until the icy water washed around his boots. He stared out toward the horizon, endless gray meeting endless blue, and spoke softly. "Rest easy, boys," he said. "You're home now." He set the wreath down, and the current caught it. The flowers drifted outward, spinning gently. For a long moment they stayed close, then the tide began to carry them away. The sun broke through the clouds just then, sending a sheet of gold across the surface of the water. The lilies glowed like lanterns, bright against the steel-gray sea. Someone behind Malcolm gasped quietly. Others bowed their heads. It was as if the ocean had waited for that exact moment to breathe again. Dr. Hall stepped beside him, her voice barely above the wind. "It's beautiful," she said. Malcolm didn't trust himself to speak. He only nodded, watching the wreath drift farther and farther until it became part of the horizon. When the ceremony ended, people lingered. Families placed flowers at the stone marker, touching the engraved names with trembling fingers. Some wept. Some stood in silence. A few spoke to the air as if the ones they had lost could still hear them. Malcolm stood apart, quiet, hands folded. He didn't belong to the Navy or to those families, but somehow he belonged here all the same. The sea had chosen him to find what it had hidden, and that meant something. In the days that followed, Crescent Bay changed. The temporary fences were removed, the trucks left, and the sound of engines gave way once more to the rhythm of the waves. But the town wasn't the same. It felt awake. Visitors began to come, veterans, historians, families who had read about the discovery. The town council built a wooden walkway down to the memorial stone, and benches were added along the dunes. Every few days, fresh flowers appeared by the plaque. The beach that had once been just another stretch of sand was now a place of remembrance. Malcolm's life returned to its quiet rhythm, but the silence felt different. He still rose before sunrise, still walked the shore, still cast his nets into the cold morning waters. But people greeted him differently now. Some stopped to thank him. Others just nodded. There was no pride in it for him, only gratitude. He didn't talk about what he'd found. He didn't need to. The sea had told its story, and that was enough. One evening, as autumn settled over Maine, Malcolm returned to the beach alone. The wind carried the smell of salt and distant rain. The memorial stone stood dark and steady behind him, catching the last glow of sunset. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the photograph Dr. Hall had given him, the copy of the one recovered from the wreck. 3 young sailors, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. The edges had begun to fade, but the faces were still bright. He looked at them for a long time. Then he whispered, "You're remembered. That's what matters." The words drifted away with the wind, swallowed by the rhythm of the tide. The waves touched the shore and slipped back again, calm, patient, eternal. For the first time in years, Malcolm felt something ease inside him. The loneliness that had followed him since Lena's death, the weight he had carried without realizing it. It loosened. The sea had taken much from him, but this time it had given something back. Peace. The last light bled out across the horizon. The sky turned to fire, then to deep indigo. The memorial stone behind him glowed faintly in the twilight. Malcolm turned toward home, his steps slow but sure. The ocean whispered behind him, steady and alive, its voice neither cruel nor kind, just honest. Some secrets, he thought, are meant to stay buried, but others rise again, so the living can remember the dead. As he reached the path leading back to his cottage, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. The sea shimmered gold under the fading light, and somewhere below that surface, the great chain lay still, its purpose fulfilled. Crescent Bay was quiet again, not haunted but healed. And in the sound of the tide, Malcolm Reed heard the truth he had waited his whole life to understand. Even the deepest losses can one day find their way back to the surface. The ocean hides many secrets, but some refuse to stay buried forever. If this story moved you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. See you in the next story.